You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. I'm John Irvine, and welcome to Light in the D. Well, hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Light in the D. We're going to call this episode 1.2. It's part 2 of our 4-part interview with Adam Barron. But first, I just want to say I hope everyone is safe and warm and dry. And my gosh, February, I guess winter decided to come in with full force. We were experiencing what you might call a tropical winter, if you will, in January, if you want to call 30s and low 40s and not a lot of snow. It was a mild January, and I imagine somebody said, "Hey, winter, bring it." And February, winter said, "Okay, here I am." There you go. So I hope everyone is well. Anyway, so again, we're continuing our interview with Adam Barron, and for those of you who may be just joining us, Adam is the Director of Community Engagement and Strategy and the Special Assistant to the President at Rochester University. He's also the founding director of the Tatlow Society, and we're going to get into that in part 4 of our interview with Adam. But today we're continuing on. In part 1, we discussed the state of affairs in collegiate ministry today on university campuses. And today, Adam is going to give us a history lesson of Christ-centered outreach and evangelism and parachurches here in the United States. So we're going to go back about 100 years or so. So if you're a history buff like I am, I hope you enjoy part 2 of our interview with Adam Barron. Hey, Adam, welcome back to Light in the D. It's good to have you back, brother. How you doing?
Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having me. I'm glad that we can jump back into talking about collegiate ministry in the modern age, both past, present, and maybe future, where things are going. So thanks for having me, and can't wait to talk about point 2.
So I want to remind everyone of who you are. And Adam is the Director of Community Engagement and Strategy. He's Special Assistant to the President at Rochester University. That's a mouthful, in Rochester, Michigan. And you're also the founding director of the Tatlow Society, which exists to strategically advance the mission expansion work of local, national, and international intercollegiate campus ministries. So we're gonna get into that. But as you said, when we last spoke, we talked briefly about the state of affairs in higher education from a Christian worldview. And today we want to kind of go back in history and talk about the history of Christ-centered outreach, evangelism, and student engagement by the church and parachurch ministries. So, Adam, kind of where to begin. I think we want to go back to the turn of the century, of the 19th century.
Yeah, 19th to the 20th is probably a good place to start. And I love talking about the history of collegiate ministries because these are the shoulders upon which we stand.
Yeah. And
I think in the 21st century and throughout the 20th century, there was some refer to the 20th century as the Evangelical Century, and it's referred to the Evangelical Century because of the growth of the evangelical church and piety, not just in North America but around the world, and a lot of that growth had to do with collegiate ministries and the early pioneers of really identifying and establishing and growing ministries amongst university students, whether that was professional clergy, formal churchmen, or it was undergraduates at colleges and universities in the UK and the United States and in Canada that were themselves pioneering a ministry to their peers.
Okay.
So I have what John Maxwell says. Do you have your 10,000 hours? I've got my 10,000 hours in
and more,
and probably more in studying the roots and relevance of collegiate ministry in the last 150 years and the effect that that's had around the world. And so when I think about the present modern age, and I'll name off a dozen different contemporary collegiate ministry organizations, I think about some of them are very large, and I think about those ministries in the context of the men and women from a bygone era who were really the tip of the spear, who were really the pioneers, who face really sometimes significant challenges to establish and launch a ministry that was peer-to-peer, that was on a college or university campus like Oxford University or Cambridge University. And it was not straightforward. It was not an easy early moments for that to happen.
Let's talk about that. I mean, what were some of those challenges that they faced then? And I don't know, if you can relate to how that relates to today. Are they similar challenges, or are they different today? What were they facing then?
So just to try to locate us and locate the conversation, I think a good place to start would be in the UK. And I have I've got 3 master's degrees, and my third degree was from King's College, London, which is a part of the University of London, one of the oldest schools in the UK, right in the heart of London. And I wrote a dissertation titled Student Christianity, Its Roots and Relevance in Mission and Ministry in the Modern Age. And what I studied was what is historians called intellectual and social history. And so you try to drill down to what were the ideas, the people, the books, the events at that moment in time that was shaping a particular culture. So, for example, oftentimes people talk about history as history studied from above, where you're studying like broad themes, studying the history of the monarchy throughout the last 1,000 years. And then there's another view of history, which is called a history from below. And that history from below is often that intellectual and social history. So what I did was I went back in time to ideas and books and people and sources that would paint a picture of who were the young men and the young women in the UK, and then the subsequent influence that had in the United States, that started and established some very dynamic and robust collegiate ministries. So, for example, in 1886, 87, 88, there was what was established at Cambridge University called the Inter-Collegiate Cambridge Christian Union. And that became a lay-led, undergrad-led collegiate ministry to their peers. It was no small act of God for that to take place. In fact, I read stories about students who were referred to as nonconformists. The nonconformists were the Protestants, basically, who were like Methodists and Baptists and non-denominational Christians, Brethren, Quakers, things like that were matriculating up to university, up to Cambridge and Oxford, and they were bringing their evangelical piety with them. But these institutions like Cambridge and Oxford were they were religious universities. Every college has a chapel. Every chapel has a full-time chaplain and campus minister. And so, but they were professional clergy who were collared clergy, whether that was Church of England or Roman Catholic. So for a young 18 or 19-year-old to bring out the Bible and say, I want to evangelize my peers, it was really the professional clergy said, well, wait a second, that's our job.
Yeah.
That's what we do. Yeah. And in fact, you had to be licensed to be a minister in the Church of England and in the UK. So for an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old to say, well, I want to lead a Bible study and I want to do an evangelistic crusade and I want to do it on campus. I read stories about students who actually got kicked out of school for wanting to do that.
Wow. Yeah.
So those aren't the same challenges that we face today. I mean, in a not a dissimilar way, I think what the challenge is today is you're not getting kicked out of school because you want to lead a Bible study, but maybe you are socially kicked out. You are ostracized in some particular way. You're for wanting to believe in God and share your faith with others. But going back to Cambridge and Oxford, these young pimple-faced undergrads, through an act of parliament, one step that had to take place was there was an act of parliament in the UK that allowed nonconformists to matriculate up to places like Cambridge, Oxford, Durham, which typically was for the Church of England aristocracy, or Roman Catholic aristocracy, industrialists, and the elite. And then at that time, universities were changing; they were growing. They went from what are called the brownstones to the red bricks to modern universities. Brownstones were the old schools, like Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, King's College in Scotland, Edinburgh, St. Andrews, places like that. And then there were the red bricks that were growing, University of Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, these second level they're great universities today, but second tier type universities, not those original predominantly two most famous in Cambridge and Oxford. And then other universities grew and grew, and the population grew, and students matriculating up to university grew, and so the opportunity to reach undergrads grew a lot, and that was in the UK. So that was stirring. And then another significant event I like to talk a lot about in the United States in 1886. There was a man, most of us are familiar with D.L. Moody, famous Bible teacher and evangelist. And in 1886, he had a home in Northfield, Massachusetts. And he was inviting, in 85 and then again in 86, he was inviting all the YMCA chapters from predominantly Ivy League schools, because at that time there was expansion across the Midwest and to a certain degree all the way to the West Coast. But in terms of student population, it was still heavily on the East Coast, some smaller schools across the Midwest, some larger ones being established. But Moody invited all these YMCA chapters to his home in Northfield, Massachusetts in the summer of 1885 and then again in 1886. In 1886, there was maybe 450 to 500 collegiate undergrad students there. And these undergrads, and the YMCA chapter at that time was very evangelistic in its orientation.
Were they aware of what was going on in the UK? Were they being influenced by that, or was this like two separate things happening at the same time across continents?
Yeah, no, I think that it wasn't like we have the kind of ability to communicate like we do today at all. But there was knowledge of what was going on both sides of the pond. There was some knowledge of what was going on, and Moody had a ministry both sides of the pond. So he would be leading at Oxford. He might, and in fact, there's a story, one of the books I have behind me, of what's called the Cambridge Seven, and they heard D.L. Moody preach in the UK. At Cambridge, and then also at Oxford. And there's some really just fascinating stories about him being there, preaching to undergrad students through invitation to the university, and young people giving their lives to Christ. The Cambridge Seven is a famous story of these 7 young men who all came from pretty privileged homes, and they all both committed their lives to Christ and committed their lives to world missions. And those young men, some of them came to the United States and did like a speaking tour at colleges all across the US, talking about their faith and also talking about world missions.
Wow.
So there was a cross-pollination, definitely to a certain degree. Well, in 1886, Moody has all these YMCA undergrad students at his home in Northfield for like 30 days, like a summer camp, where they're getting Bible teaching and they're playing sports and they're fellowshipping together. But there was a few of those students, maybe a half a dozen of them, who had been influenced by their parents who were missionaries overseas. And a couple of them were at Princeton University, and they were encouraging Moody to get someone to speak about world missions and world evangelism.
Okay.
And so this is a really neat Detroit connection, because the person that Moody called upon was a fellow named A.T. Pearson. And A.T. Pearson was a Presbyterian minister at Fort Street Presbyterian Church in downtown Detroit. And he was known as someone who was speaking about world evangelism and world missions. And he had a phrase that people associate with what became known as the student volunteer movement for foreign mission. And the phrase was the evangelization of the world in our generation. Mm. And so A.T. Pearson is invited in the summer of 1886 to this YMCA event at Moody's Northfield, Massachusetts home. He's preaching about world missions to all these undergrads. There's a famous story about how 100 of the undergrads raised their hands and said, "I dedicate my life to world missions." And that became known as what became an organization known as the Student Volunteer Movement for Foreign Mission. And one of the undergrad students there at the time was a fellow named John Mott. John Mott was a junior or a senior at Cornell University. And John Mott, he became, after he graduated, the first traveling secretary for the student volunteer movement. And so he would go to other colleges and universities across the East Coast, Midwest, and I don't know how far west he actually went, but he would encourage undergrads to think about their faith in Christ, their commitment to Christ, and their commitment to world missions. And that organization, one author has said, in like around the turn of the century now, now in the early 1909, 1910, 1920, those early parts of the 20th century, one writer says Christianity was for the first time becoming a world religion, and it was largely in the hands of undergraduate students.
Wow.
They were largely leading this push for world mission. And this John Mott was the head of that organization. He later, when he was 81 years old, he received a Nobel Peace Prize for the ecumenical work he did, helping to establish the World Council of Churches and ecumenicalism around the world, and helping Christian students, university students around the world, form a federation. It's really remarkable story, John Mott's story. So from Cambridge and Oxford to getting kicked off campus for wanting to do a Bible study, to then turn of the century to a guy like John Mott, who's a young man leading this global mission movement. There was in 1910, there was a famous a missionary conference headed at Edinburgh University. And John Mott, now at that point, he was probably in his early 30s, he was the chairman of this famous 1910 World Council of Missionaries gathering together there. It's really beautiful and remarkable, those early stories. And it was undergraduates who were on the edge of their post-adolescent, pre-adulthood, on the edge of the rest of their life, who were getting fired up and on fire for Christ and on fire for world missions, that was leading this. In fact, there was some had said, there was some people within the church that kind of felt a little bit like the student volunteer movement was outflanking the role of the church in traditional missions, which usually came through denominational channels. Yeah. And so Mott tried to work really hard with the churches. A.T. Pearson did as well. I mean, he was a Presbyterian minister. He was the editor for a journal at the time called the Mission Review Journal, or Missionary Review. Okay. And it was a famous journal. Churches read it. It was all about world missions and what was going on around the world. Well, A.T. Pierson led that out of his church in Detroit. And that church in Detroit grew and grew and grew. It would be the equivalent of maybe kind of like a Rick Warren and Saddleback Church. I mean, we had our own Saddleback Church called Fort Street Presbyterian 100 years ago in Detroit. And it had a huge effect. He had a huge effect on, I don't have it in front of me now, but there's a quote basically that says, in effect, that A.T. Pierson almost single-handedly had this huge effect on American mission and American mission movement around the world at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was possible because he was enlisting all of these undergrad students at the universities that he was speaking at, or the Moody conferences that he would go to speak at, the development of the student volunteer movement. So that's kind of a bit of the past, and its history. Just a slice of it, really.
Sure.
Referring to some activity at Cambridge, and then the things that were happening with D.L. Moody and A.T. Pierson in 1886 at Northfield, Massachusetts. It's an understatement to say that it was mildly significant. It was exponentially significant in the history of global mission and the relationship between that and undergrad college students. It was kind of in my view, it was part of their DNA, part of their piety. Yeah. It was this sense of calling, conviction. I've been at Yale Divinity School, where I did some of my research for my dissertation, at the Mission Day Collection Library, which it's a special collection that predominantly houses John Mott's personal library. And you can go there and you can see the thousands of applications from college students who joined the student volunteer movement, who filled out an application wanting to be a missionary. And if they did go overseas, all the applications are marked with in red letters or black letters, sailed on the application. So that person went, they sailed, they didn't fly. They took a train, a boat, and they sailed across the seas. And my family had the privilege, while I was in London studying, to then go work for a university in Shanghai, China, called the university I worked for before was Pepperdine University in Malibu, California. We left there so I could go to grad school in London. And then Pepperdine called and invited us to go to Shanghai to be the visiting faculty family at their study abroad center in Shanghai. And it was such a neat experience for me, because I felt like God just in almost like full circle way had me studying about these young men and young women in London. And then I get to sail to where they sailed to, which was many of them went to Shanghai. Yeah. It was a concession city. The government allowed other governments to establish trading ports in Shanghai. And so a lot of the missionaries came through Shanghai to Asia, establishing schools and churches and hospitals. And so while we were there for 6 months, I got to chase after some of the ghosts of young men and young women who I had been reading about before 6 months earlier in London, England. It's a really neat experience. Wow. So that's the past. There's a lot we can now say about kind of what's going on now. But
well, hey, everyone, we're going to take a pause in our conversation with Adam Barron at this point, and we're going to pick up in part 3. And we're going to talk about how the past has impacted where collegiate ministry is today. And so please be on the lookout for part 3 of our conversation with Adam. In the meantime, subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this content on YouTube. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and wherever podcasts can be found. And in the meantime, thank you again for watching and listening to Light in the D. Go on out there and be a light in the darkness yourself, and God's blessings to you all. Thank you. Bye.